everybody, it's Dr. Gilchrist. As you know, we obviously did not have class yesterday because we do have an exam, despite the fact that I have made it a take-home exam. I still want to stay on track as much as I can going over this information with you. So if you will permit me, as I kind of promised, I will record the remainder of discussing changing our health behaviors. And then when we reconvene on Tuesday, we'll go ahead and talk about changing our different health behaviors. So we're talking about changing health behaviors, and then next week we'll talk about the actual health behaviors. If we need additional time on Thursday, even though the exam is a take-home and will be due Thursday at 11, that will give us time to finish up anything that we didn't finish in class the first time. Also, if we want to on Tuesday, we can kind of check in and see how everybody is doing after the weekend. As much as possible, keep the lines of communication open with me. If you need me for any reason, or if you are having concerns or you're struggling, always remember that I'm happy to help you out, and I always prefer that you talk to me. I'm not going to get mad or upset. Like, these are normal parts of life, and sometimes they're hard to navigate, and so I want to help you navigate those as best you can. So speak with me if you need additional time for things. I'd be happy to help you out. So one thing that works for me when I'm kind of struggling is to go ahead and continue teaching, because teaching is what makes me really happy. So if you'll permit me, I would like to continue discussing some of these different concepts related to changing our health behaviors. So where we left off last time is that in general, health behavior is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. It is made up of your genetic predispositions for a variety of different things. It is made up of things like age. We have our psychological factors, so the way that we view things is going to affect our health behavior. Our biases, our emotions, our motivation, all of these things will work to affect our health behaviors. And we do also have our social factors. So I want to spend a little bit of time going over each of these different factors. Health behavior is biopsychosocial, and that means that there are going to be a lot of factors coming into play here. So as we talked about last time, we do have genetic predispositions for various things. We inherit things like metabolic rates, so people who have an easier time putting on weight compared to others, there's probably a pretty strong genetic component there. How easily you lose weight, what kind of muscle definition that you have. Additionally, things like addiction can also have genetic components. So your textbook mentions that dopaminergic receptors, so the receptors that respond to dopamine, you have about 5 of them, but the receptor gene that is for the genes that code for receptor D2 do play a role in whether or not you develop alcoholism. Now, does that mean that if you carry the gene, you are necessarily going to struggle with alcoholism? Of course not. Addiction is a biopsychosocial phenomenon, as is anything else dealing with people. So you do have predispositions, but they are not necessarily destiny. We also know that age has a biological effect on our health behaviors. You are going to have an easier time getting physical activity when you are younger. Your metabolism is going to work faster when you are younger, and that's going to potentially change the type of health behaviors you can engage in. Now, your book relates this to gender, but I would argue that it's more determined by sex, because we are talking about the relationships that hormones have as well. But people who are assigned female at birth tend to have less estrogen, circulating through their bodies compared to people who are assigned male at birth. The type of hormones that you have affect how much body fat you're going to have. We know in general that people that are assigned female at birth, by virtue of hormones, often are going to carry more body fat than people who are assigned male at birth. This will also affect muscle formation. Testosterone tends to be a more ideal hormone for muscle growth and muscle development compared to something like estrogen. So those are the biological factors, and that's kind of where we ended up last time. So now I want to talk about the psychological and the social factors. So one of the things that I mentioned in general across the board is that when we look at things like your big 5-factor traits, so conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion, we know a couple of different things. So first of all, in general, extroversion can be related to health behaviors, particularly if you are male. So we know, for example, that boys that tend to rate higher in extroversion, they are more likely to engage in risky practices, unsafe activities, things that might be potentially detrimental to one's quality of life. So we can see where extroversion can potentially affect health behaviors. We also know that people who tend to be higher in conscientiousness, so that's self-discipline, and agreeableness, cooperativeness, working well with other people, they are more likely to engage in healthier behaviors in the first place, and they're also more likely to be kind of focusing on modifying their health behaviors. Now, in addition to these aspects, besides personality traits, we know that learning and conditioning factors can also play a role. So we're going to kind of talk about this in chapter 8 when we talk about nutrition and our eating behaviors. But in general, foods that are paired with a reward are often more likely to be preferred than those that are not. Foods that are associated with reward or treated as a reward will often be preferred. Additionally, we know that cognitive biases, the way that we view the world, will affect our health behaviors, as well as our emotions and our motivation. And then finally, we have those environmental or social factors. Media messages and our culture influence our health behaviors. As I've kind of mentioned, socioeconomic status kind of affects that as well. As we talked about very early on in this class, socioeconomic status will affect your health behaviors because it affects your access. So it affects your access to fresh, healthy food. It affects your access to healthcare, health insurance, things that would provide promotion of health behaviors. We know that the media plays a role. So oftentimes things that are shown in the media, they tend to be normalized for people. And as a result, that can influence the health behaviors that we do or do not engage in. Additionally, social support or feeling like we don't have social support may also affect our health behaviors. If you believe that the people around you depend on you and need you to be there for them, you might be considerably more likely to be inclined to change a health behavior, not only for your own benefit, but for the benefit of other people around you. Additionally, one of the things that I would also mention that is so beneficial with social support when you're changing a behavior is that other people can hold you accountable. When I first started running, for example, it wasn't something I always liked to do, and so what I would do was I would run around outside and I would run by the places of people I knew. And yeah, in my mind now, that sounds a little stalkery, but at the time the idea was if I run by people that I know and they see me, they're going to notice if I don't run there after a little while. They are going to hold me accountable. And having that social support can provide a sense of accountability that will help you keep that behavior going. So now let's talk about a very general plan that you can do to basically change your health behaviors. Now, a good chunk of this is summarized in table 7.2 of your book, and ideally, a lot of this should look familiar to you when we were beginning to plan the different steps of our health intervention. I had you pick a specific goal. I gave you I encouraged you to find a way to track your progress. I asked you to anticipate potential barriers and find ways to work around them. And so as we go over this general plan, hopefully you're kind of seeing some of the commonalities between what is suggested here and then what I actually gave you to work with in your health behavior modification project. So many of these steps are going to look similar to our project steps. Your very first step will be to pick some kind of behavior. Now, here's what's really critical. You need it to be specific. It's a lot harder if I say, I want to be healthier. Well, cool. That could refer to a lot of different things. So we need it to be specific because if it's vague, you won't have a clear guideline of when you've actually reached that or not. So you need to have a specific guideline. Additionally, you don't want this goal to be so easy that you can meet it. You want it to actually be something that you can achieve, but does require a bit of a challenge. So compare this kind of goal. I want to eat healthier. Okay, great. How are we going to know what that looks like? How will you know when you achieved it? And what are those benchmarks for your progress? Now compare that to, I want to eat at least 3 to 4 servings of vegetables a day for the next 3 months. Challenging, but doable, very specific. Additionally, one of the other things that your book recommends is potentially coming up with a behavior contract, keeping an eye on your behaviors and recording them, recording your behaviors, monitoring your behavior, and kind of holding yourself accountable. I would also say that for some people, telling other people about your goals and that this is important to you is going to be really vital because they can hold you accountable. Now, to change a behavior, you need to know what your behavior looks like ahead of time before you start trying to introduce a modification to that behavior. So we want to get a pretty good measure of what our baseline is. So if you want to eat more vegetables, what is it looking like before you introduce that plan? Which is why I have encouraged you for your project to get at least 2 weeks of baseline data. What do you look like when you're not putting this intervention into action? So the next step that you have is identifying your barriers to change. We are creatures of habit, and as a result, we are going to be very hard pressed to change something when we feel comfortable. We are not good at sitting with discomfort or changing things that feel like they're working for us. Now, your barriers or your obstacles can be practical or they can be psychological in nature. So a practical barrier could be something like, I don't have the time, I don't have the money. Maybe there are, if I'm wanting to exercise at a gym more, maybe a gym is not close by within walking distance and I don't have a car. So that would be a case of a practical barrier. A mental barrier could be or something like thinking that you're not going to be able to do this or that it's going to be really hard. So at that point, anticipate the potential barriers that could come from practical aspects in the environment or from your own mind and provide and start thinking of solutions or strategies that you can actually use to overcome them. And your book actually mentions that every barrier needs a solution. So if you don't think you have the time to fit this in, think about little pockets of time. So if you want to try to exercise more often, but you feel like you don't have the time, find little pockets within the day where you can get maybe 10 to 15 minutes of exercise instead of saying, oh my gosh, I have to carve out an hour every other day. Find little pockets of time, and that can be a potential solution. So for every barrier, try to see if you can find a solution. Once you have developed this, at that point, you can develop your intervention. This is where the principles of operant conditioning can be really useful. So if we want to increase a behavior, we need to find a way to make it reinforcing for us. So for example, if you want to exercise more, but you don't really find it enjoyable, one thing that I have found that often works, maybe there's a TV show that I like, or there's an audiobook I want to read or a podcast I really love to listen to, I will only listen to those things when I'm in the gym. So that kind of makes going to the gym and getting to hear that a fun little treat. So the idea is pairing that with something that I already like and I already like to do, thereby making going to the gym more likely to happen. Now, punishment is designed to decrease a behavior. I think focusing more on trying to reinforce behaviors that we want to see rather than punishing behaviors that we don't tends to be more useful. So focus on reinforcing those behaviors that you want to see. And additionally, you want to keep a record of behavior to track your progress. You're not going to have any idea if this modification worked unless you are tracking your progress and you have that baseline. So now, with that in mind, let's talk about some of the different theories and some of the different models of behavior change. So here's the thing, when we are talking about behavior modification or behavior change or interventions, theory is critical. Now, I know in the real world, when we think about changing a behavior, we don't often think about the underlying theories behind it. We're just like, oh yeah, I want to exercise more. I want to eat healthier, but we don't think about maybe the best way to approach the progress or underlying theories that might explain why certain plans work the way they do. But for researchers, theory is going to be really important. For a health psychologist, theories not only explain behavior and why we see certain behaviors, but they also provide ways that we can influence and change those health behaviors. In particular, certain theories may explain why some health behaviors are hard to change. Why is smoking so difficult for so many people to quit? The TransAttic model might be able to explain that to us. Additionally, and I think this is really key, if you try to modify your behavior and you find that you get a behavioral change, you won't necessarily be able to understand why the intervention or the treatment was successful unless it is based on a theory. Because the theory will help you make predictions about what you should see based on this intervention. Without the guidance of that theory, you don't necessarily have any idea why the treatment worked for you. And generally, what we're going to find is that programs of behavior change for health behaviors often are going to be more effective when they're actually based on a theory. So we're going to talk about a few different theories of behavior change. We're going to talk about the social cognitive theory that was developed by Albert Bandura. You might have heard about it in a few of your other classes. The TransAttic model, the health belief model, and the theory of planned behavior. Now, some of you might be familiar with the theory of planned behavior because it doesn't just occur in a health psychology context. Several years ago, I taught a class in industrial organizational psychology, which is all about the psychology of the workplace. And the theory of planned behavior also comes into play when we are talking about describing different types of workplace behaviors. So I'm going to start by talking about the social cognitive theory. Now, as I mentioned, this was developed by Albert Bandura, and this, in general, he believed that the world is made up of these complex interactions between persons, environments, and behaviors. So basically, the idea behind the social cognitive theory is that your personality traits influence the environment and the other people around you, and likewise, other people and the environment also push back against you. And the behaviors will ultimately play a role in that as well. So, for example, you may find that the more that you cooperate with somebody, the more that you have to work together on a project, oftentimes we'll find that those people like each other more because they have been required to basically work on these cooperative behaviors together. And Bandura believed that these characteristics and these interactions ultimately determined whether or not somebody engaged in a health behavior or generally any kind of behavior. And one of the other major contributions of the social cognitive theory, according to Bandura, was the role of self-efficacy. believing that you would be able to exert an effort and succeed. And ultimately, according to the social cognitive theory, this is ultimately the greatest determinant of health behavior. Basically, believing that you can do something and that you will be successful in your efforts is ultimately going to be the greatest determinant of whether or not you engage in a behavior change, and additionally, whether or not you succeed. Now, one thing I will mention about the social cognitive theory is that as it is described here, it is often very vague. There is this notion that persons interact with situations and thus shape each other, a concept that Bandura referred to as reciprocal determinism, but in general, he spends far more time focusing on the situation than how the person actually contributes to this phenomenon. So now we're going to actually talk about some theories related specifically to behavioral change as it pertains to health. And the very first one that we are going to talk about is what is called the TransAttic Model. So one of the things that I will kind of mention from your book, the reason that this is referred to as the TransAttic Model is that there are a lot of different theories, and prior to this model being developed, there were a lot of different theories as to why behavior changed, how we think about behavior change, and how do we attempt to change. And so the TransAttic Model basically was trying to look for some common themes across a variety of different theories. So prior to the development of the TransAttic Model, the general models for behavior change were basically as follows. You've got your behaviorists who are like, okay, let's use either classical conditioning principles or operant conditioning principles, things like reward and punishment to create change. You have people like your humanistic psychologists such as Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow that basically say that if you want to create change, you have to build nurturing relationships with others and encourage each other to grow. And then generally, the psychoanalytic perspective or the psychodynamic perspective has this idea that change only comes about by making the unconscious conscious. So we have a lot of these different competing theories, and so researchers were trying to look for the common themes in all of these different perspectives. And basically what they came up with was a 6-stage model. So the behavioral change occurs in 6 different stages. This was originally done based on research on smokers who either were not interested in quitting or did actually manage to quit. And the idea here is that we actually go through or process through these different stages as we consider changing a health behavior, actually make the attempt and commit to changing a health behavior, and then successfully changing that health behavior. Now, here's what's kind of an important implication. So this is kind of everybody that you know that is potentially looking to change a health behavior is probably going to be in a different stage. That means if somebody is not aware that they have a problem, and they are not interested in changing, a stage in the TransAttic Model that is called pre-contemplation. The idea here is that an intervention is not going to work. A certain type of intervention will not work on a person who is in that pre-contemplation stage. They don't think they have a problem. Likewise, somebody who is trying to maintain a healthy behavior is probably going to need a different intervention than somebody who is just beginning to change this behavior. So the implication of this is that people are going to go through these different stages, and each of these stages are unique in terms of the things that people are thinking about, their commitment levels, their emotions, and so interventions have to be tailored to the stage that somebody is actually residing in. So we're going to go through these 6 different stages right here. So these are the 6 stages of the TransAttic Model. And as I've already kind of talked about, pre-contemplation is the first stage. Basically, at this point, people are not aware that their behavior is unhealthy, And additionally, or if they aren't aware of their behavior, they have no intention to basically change, particularly if they are not planning to change it within the next 6 months. And the reason that people could potentially be in the pre-contemplation stage is because maybe they've tried it before, maybe they've been exposed to some misinformation, maybe they're in denial about their own health. So generally what we're going to find is that a lot of people in this stage are going to be really avoidant. They're not really going to talk a lot about their unhealthy behaviors. And generally, programs that are about promoting health, they are not going to serve these people because they either think they don't have a problem, or if they're aware that they have a problem, they're not interested in changing it. Next, here's what's really critical. Let's say that you are aware, I have a problem. I have something unhealthy and I may want to change it within the next month or so. This would be considered, according to the TransAttic Model, the contemplation stage. So this is more about awareness of changing, but there's not necessarily a commitment at this point. This is a state that is very ambivalent because people are beginning to weigh the pros and the cons. And because they are in that stage where they're kind of weighing the possibilities or the consequences without really having any sort of commitment to change, people can tend to stay in the contemplation stage for a little while. Now, preparation is really critical because the preparation stage is the very first time that we actually get some commitment. This is when the person is committed to changing their behavior. They are potentially interested in spending time changing their behavior. They're potentially interested in spending money to change their behavior, and all of that has a commitment. So generally, if you want an intervention to be effective, you actually need people who are committed to starting to make that change. So interventions are generally only going to work on people who are in the preparation stage or higher. In the case of the contemplation stage, you might need a very special intervention because they're still ambivalent. But generally, interventions are going to be effective for most people once they're in that preparation stage. Now, when you're actually changing the behavior, at that point, you are in the action stage. Now, here's what's really critical. The change has to have taken place over the past 6 months, and it involves an active effort. Now, here's what's really critical. Is doing just a little bit enough to qualify as actually being in the action stage? That's not it. You have to act enough and have engaged in this behavior enough to actually reduce your risk of whatever disease or unhealthy state that you are dealing with in this case. After action, you are going to be in maintenance. Maintenance is often marked by continuing to maintain those behaviors and really generally trying not to relapse. So you are still changing the behavior, but it doesn't require as much work or as much effort as action does. And beginning in maintenance, you have a lot less temptation that you are potentially dealing with because you've been engaged in this for a long time. Now, at the final stage, we have what is called the termination stage. At this point, this is when people are no longer tempted by the unhealthy behavior that they were doing before. This is a stage that can actually be really hard to achieve, and very few people actually do. Generally, less than 20% of smokers that are trying to quit actually reach the point where they are no longer tempted by the different sensory cues associated with smoking. So what we're often going to find is that a lot of interventions focus on maintenance rather than termination. So now we're moving on to the health belief model. The basic premise of the health belief model is that people are going to engage in a behavior based on what they believe. Well, okay, great, but what are those beliefs? So first of all, if I'm wanting to eat more fruits and vegetables, the questions that I have to ask myself, and when the model was originally introduced, these were the three main beliefs. How effective is my behavior going to be in reducing my risk? How easy will it be to engage in these healthy behaviors? And then finally, what are going to be the consequences of my behavior? So what we're basically looking at here is we are looking at the probability that somebody is likely to change, and we're also looking at what the expected outcome is. So what's actually kind of interesting is this is what is referred to as a value expectancy theory, because we're kind of trying to figure out what the value of changing is, what the probability of changing is, and what the outcomes will be should we decide to engage in that behavior. So we're trying to make predictions based on the value that this will potentially bring us. Now, over time, people began to think that perhaps there needed to be more ideas and more beliefs actually added to the health belief model. So what you're seeing here is figure 7.3 in your book. So basically, this is the newer version of the health belief model. So first of all, we need to believe in what that threat is. So our unhealthy behavior is potentially the threat. The very first thing that we need to do is figure out, do we believe that this is a health threat? From this, we need to think about general beliefs. How concerned are we about our health? Do we care about our health? We need to focus on the specific beliefs about how susceptible we are to these health threats or how vulnerable we are to these conditions. And then the consequences or the severity of encountering that threat, being exposed to that threat, particularly when we don't change our behavior. So what are the negative consequences if we don't take action? Now, we also have to talk about our belief in whether or not our behavior will be effective. So first of all, we have this general question. We need to focus on the perceived effectiveness. Will this be effective to reduce the severity? What are the benefits of the behavior? What kind of barriers do we perceive with these? And do the benefits ultimately outweigh the costs of the behavior? And then finally, just as Albert Bandura added self-efficacy to the social cognitive model, self-efficacy matters here. It is not enough to know about what behaviors are effective to reduce severity and susceptibility. You also need to actually believe that you can do it. So this is a model that is based on beliefs. And one of the things that we know is that health practices vary by culture. Likewise, health beliefs vary by culture. So what this means is that the health belief model can actually be applied to different situations to figure out why different groups potentially engage in different types of health behaviors. So for example, your textbook talks first of all about body image in Black Americans versus white Americans, and you can kind of see how beliefs shape thoughts about body image for that. Your book also talks about health-seeking behaviors. So for example, people in the US that are of Asian descent are reported to basically underuse mental health services compared to white Americans. So what they ended up finding is that in general, the beliefs that ultimately differed, people who were Asian American actually had greater perceived barriers to help seeking compared to white Americans. Additionally, perceived severity also seemed to be related to whether or not Asian Americans or white Americans ultimately engaged in help-seeking behavior for mental health services. So if we have an understanding of what different cultures believe with respect to health, what we're going to find is that we might be able to potentially explain why these different cultural groups differ in different types of health behaviors. So now we're going to talk about the theory of planned behavior, which was developed by Asgen. And as I mentioned before, I largely have talked about the theory of planned behavior in my IO Psych class, which is a class about the psychology of the workplace. So the theory of planned behavior is basically a theory that is based on intention. So if you are interested in whether or not somebody wants to get Mexican for dinner, your best bet is going to be to ask them what they intend to do. Now, when we talk about intention here can basically be defined as your subjective likelihood that you're actually going to perform that behavior. So one of the things that's kind of important about Ajzen's theory of planned behavior is that in general, we are going to consider the implications and the consequences of behavior before we actually engage in that behavior. And that is largely going to be informed by our intention. Additionally, what's kind of interesting here, and if you've had me for cognitive psych, you'll know why I'm a little skeptical, but by and large, we are assuming rational choices and decision-making processes here. So our intent to perform the action ultimately determines what action we take. Now, what's really kind of important with this model is that your intention is shaped by a variety of different things. So first of all, your intentions are related to your attitudes towards certain behaviors. So if you believe that eating healthy is important and somebody asks you, do you want a slice of cake? Odds are pretty good. If you have the attitude that being healthy is important, you're going to be less likely to take that cake. However, you also have perceived social norms coming into play. What other people value around you is ultimately going to affect what you pick. So when we talk about social norms, we're kind of talking about normative beliefs. This is your interpretation of what other people think about the behavior. So for example, if everybody is having cake around you, you're going to have the social norm that everybody else wants to have cake. And even though you might have the attitude that it's important to be healthy, those social norms can potentially influence your intention. Now, what also kind of factors in here is motivation to comply. How willing are you to go with other people's preferences? If everybody else is eating cake, are you going to be more likely to feel that pressure to go along with the group, or are you comfortable with being different? Now, additionally, self-efficacy, your perception of control in this situation is also going to matter here. So you are going to basically eat a piece of cake if it's a norm around you, if you feel like you have a lot of control over the situation, and you have a positive attitude about eating cake. So here's one of the things that I think is kind of critical when we kind of focus on the theory of planned behavior before I talk about culture. Something that your book doesn't talk about, but I know about just from my experiences talking about the theory of planned behavior in other classes, is that even if there's something that we value based on our attitude, and even if meeting the goal would produce good outcomes, if our effort is not going to affect the goal, we're probably not going to do it. So if we don't feel like we have a lot of control over this situation, if we don't have that perceived control, that self-efficacy, even if you have the intention to perform a behavior, if you believe that you don't have control over the situation, you may not always behave in the way that your intentions or attitudes would predict. Now, talking about how this fits in with culture. So we know that culture predicts the kind of attitudes that we have, and our attitudes are not perfect predictors of behavior, but by and large, they do partially affect our behavior. Now, what we're going to find is that for our intentions, our attitudes are the most important aspect. And additionally, researchers have found that intentions can predict behavior across different cultural groups. So again, kind of focusing on ethnic groups here, researchers have looked at how these different components of planned behavior apply to things like breastfeeding children and how those vary across different ethnic groups. Now, I've kind of talked about these models in detail, but there are a lot of limitations with them, and your book kind of goes over them in more detail than I will. One of the first things we know is that our mindsets change over time. I am somebody who would probably never have run a lot if you had asked me about 10 years ago. However, I am a regular one now. My mindset has changed over time, and none of the models predict that change is possible. Additionally, something that I kind of talked about on Tuesday is what is referred to as the intention-behavior gap. We can have an intention to change our behavior, and sometimes even with the intention, even knowing that it's good for us, we still may not choose to engage in that behavior. And none of the models can explain why this intention-behavior gap exists. With respect to the trans-theoretical model, researchers have argued that the stages are very arbitrary, and they've also noted that the stages always imply forward motion. There is no going backward. There is no skipping steps. And that's not always how people change their behavior. Additionally, the models are often not going to be compared with each other. Nobody's actually tried to pit these models against each other to see which one is the most effective. So now I want to finish up this lecture by talking about interventions and different things that you can consider if you are interested in creating interventions to go out to larger groups of people. So an intervention is basically a program that is designed to either assess current behaviors, find different ways to change, measure that change, and ultimately assess the impact of that intervention. The goals are often going to be to decrease deaths due to preventable causes, things like smoking, drug use, the like, and improve quality of life. Now, you can actually vary what the focus of the intervention is. Sometimes it's designed to change attitudes. So a lot of the attitudes that we have now about smoking and how we feel about smoking are largely due to interventions that were focused on attitude change. This can also include changing our beliefs or ultimately changing our intentions. Additionally, interventions can take a variety of different designs. They may depend on the type of behavior that you're looking to change, the kind of funding that is available, and the number of people in the groups that you're trying to target. So your book goes through some general guidelines for interventions. I would encourage you to read more of those, but I'm largely just going to give you a more cursory view here. So first of all, as I kind of mentioned before, it's often better when interventions are actually based on a theory. You will be able to identify what worked and why, because a theory is basically going to explain how things should look and can make predictions on behavior. So that way, when you introduce your intervention, you will know exactly why something worked the way it did. If you don't have a theory underlying that, you don't actually know why your intervention was successful. Additionally, you need to focus on the right level of the population, and you might need to focus on critical policymakers. So for example, a Healthy Nevada initiative is specific to this city because compared to a lot of other cities in Missouri, we have a lot of setbacks. We have a lot of issues related to health. Now, certain things may need to be done at the state level. Certain things may need to be done at the national level. So it's all about thinking about what level of the population you want to target. Additionally, consider the intensity and the duration of the intervention. Interventions that are more intense tend to create better change, and interventions that tend to be sustained tend to also create sustained change. You want to target the people at risk as much as possible. You do not necessarily want to do a shotgun blast and focus on everybody. You want to specifically focus on the people you're targeting. Additionally, your intervention should be appropriate for your risk group and your factor. If you're gearing something toward high school students, don't write an advertisement that sounds like a middle-aged person going, "How do you do, fellow kids?" So you want to make sure that the writing is appropriate for your audience, and you need to consider the risk factors. The intervention should only do what it's designed to do. It should not be changing any other behavior that you are not interested in. As much as possible, you should try to prevent attrition. You want to make sure as much as possible that behavior is being changed and ultimately trying to prevent relapse of that behavior. And it's easier to do that when people don't drop out. Generally, this should be done ethically. This goes without saying, and I'm happy to share with you any ethical guidelines. And additionally, it's important to be culturally sensitive. So that is pretty much all I had for Chapter 7. We will talk about different health behaviors like healthy eating and smoking and drinking next time.